Thanks. So I'm Jeremy, that's Kim. So he and I have been working together for a few years, and so this project started out quite differently than where it is now. So we received funding about a year and a half ago to develop a wearable, a disposable patch that detects heart arrhythmias for screening of student athletes. And that evolved into sort of what we're going to present here today. So as we were sort of working on that, we saw a NASA sensor being displayed at NIAR that was testing it to be used for lightning detection on planes. And we're a physiologist, so he's a bioengineer, and we're like, dude, that's awesome. Let's put that on a human body. And that's sort of what we sort of came up with. So we've sort of secured the intellectual property to use the sensor for any kind of biological assessments. And so the cool thing about sensors, the sensors are, sensor's a sensor, right? So they're getting pretty cheap. And so one of the issues right now is that they are surface. So they're on our skin, and so they have some limitations. So what we're sort of working with is something that measures depth. And so I'll let Kim sort of tell you some of the advantages of the technology that we're working on.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. So yeah, my name is Kim Cluff. So I'm a faculty in the biomedical engineering department. So let me start out real quick with giving a quick background on what is magnetic resonance imaging. So most of you are probably familiar with MRI. It uses combination of magnetic fields and radio waves at specific frequencies to create incredible images of the human body in a very non-invasive manner. And so what if we could compress these MRI systems into something as small as a Band-Aid or a patch that you could, what if you could carry it with you and put it on your arm and measure something like blood flow? So this was part of our inspiration in this new sensor that we're developing. And this is kind of what we envision, is taking these same principles that govern magnetic resonance imaging, using magnetic fields, a combination of magnetic fields and radio frequencies in a small form factor, like a Band-Aid or a patch that could be put on different parts of the body to measure different fluid levels, like blood flow, so we envision it putting it on a leg to measure blood flow, or putting it on the head to measure intracranial fluid volumes. And so how does it work? Basically, it's a spiral coil. So it's made out of a single baseline component that's a spiral coil. And when you energize that spiral coil with a external radio frequency, it induces an alternating current that flows through the spiral coil. So if you remember from physics, anytime you have current flowing through you're going to have a subsequent magnetic field that formulates around the coil. And so when we put the patch over a limb, for example, the magnetic field, fluctuations in the magnetic field can be measured as something like blood flows through it. Okay, so we started out with this a preliminary study to test this on an arm phantom. So an arm phantom is really nothing but a fake body part. And so if you could play the video, this arm phantom has a vascular network inside of it. So you'll see some arteries and veins. It has a artificial heart pump, so it can pump blood through these arteries and veins in a pulsatile manner, just like your heart does. And then we use something called a vector network analyzer. This measures our sensor signal response. So this is going to measure the fluctuations in that magnetic field. So if I turn the heart pump on and it starts pumping blood through there, you'll see a shift that shifts in concert with the pulse volume changes as the blood pulses through the arteries. You'll see that frequency shift back and forth, and that's shifting in concert as the blood is flowing through. And so this shift we're measuring with something that's like a Band-Aid. Okay, it's a patch that's sitting on the arm. It's a that we're energizing with this external radio frequency, and we're measuring the fluctuations in the magnetic field, and we're able to correlate that with blood flow. So when we validate this against ultrasound, and so we put, you can go ahead and play that video. And so we have an ultrasound imaging system, and here's the artery inside the inside that arm phantom, and you can see it pulsing as blood pumps through that artery. Okay, and we also did pulse wave Doppler analysis here, so you can see the blood flow through the artery. And so this is the velocity profile as blood is pumping through the artery. And here is our sensor signal response. So here's that, we're measuring those fluctuations in the magnetic field, and it's shifting in concert with the blood flow. So it goes back and forth. And when we put this in a time domain response, we're able to see something that looks, a waveform pattern that looks very similar to what we see with ultrasound. And so we can see a systolic upstroke, a systolic peak, a downstroke, a dichrotic notch, and then a downstroke. And it keeps going up and down. And when we correlate this with the systolic peak in ultrasound, we get a really strong correlation. And so we're able to do this in a very simple sensor. And what makes the sensor special is that it doesn't have any batteries. It doesn't have any electrical components, and you can flex it, okay? It's flexible. And so that makes it really unique. And also, in addition, when we look at that waveform pattern, we see something that looks very similar to what's called pulse volume recording data. So in PVR data, again, you have this upstroke, a systolic peak, a downstroke, and a dichrotic notch. This is often used in diagnostics for diagnosing blockages in the arteries. So in somebody who has something like peripheral artery disease, the first thing to go would be like this dichrotic notch. Okay, so we think that perhaps this could be used as a screening tool for PAD patients. But let me move on real quick, so I just have 1 minute left. We also looked at measuring intracranial pressure with this sensor as well. So right now, the only way to measure intracranial pressure is to drill a hole through the head, which is not very attractive, right? The other way of doing it is a spinal tap, okay, or lumbar puncture in the spine. Again, invasive and not very attractive. The other way of doing it is using ultrasound, okay? So they do ultrasound through the intracranial suture joints. But the problem is ultrasound doesn't go through bone very well, okay? Sometimes they'll put it on the eye as well, but again, that's not ideal. And so the nice thing about this is because it uses magnetic fields had no problem penetrating through the bone. And so we did a little study where we measured, well, how deep can this penetrate through the bone? And we saw really good results. We even inserted a bladder inside the skull, and we filled we put the top of the skull back on, and we filled this bladder with fluid, so simulating like increased fluid volume in the brain, like swelling in the brain. And we were able to see a shift in our sensor signal response. So again, this is a non-invasive way, like a Band-Aid or a patch placed on the head to measure increased intracranial pressure. And I think I'll stop there because I'm out of time. So I guess we'll take questions. Or yes.
In terms of development, what are your next steps?
You know, I was impressed by a lot of the simulation capability that I saw earlier this morning. I would like to simulate a lot of these things. So right now, some of the models we're making are kind of benchtop or physical models. We haven't put it on the human body yet. But if we could simulate that and start to optimize the sensor parameters, like how thick the trace needs to be, the trace width, how many number of turns, and do a process called impedance matching to human tissue, so we could start making these measurements on humans. I think that would be a good next step. Yes.
Yes, I observed on your FFT display there that we also get a really good look at heart rate variability and the variability between the interbeat interval. And so in the field of biofeedback, this is often in peak performance, that interval is really highly valued. And if there's an on-the-go wearable way, I know of probably 5 companies that would probably want to buy your patch, depending on the price of it, because they're working with golfers and pitchers and all kinds of folks who can't wear a little sensor on their finger.
Absolutely. That sounds good.
That's precisely the point of this conference.
Okay. You know, I want to mention real quick also, you know, traditional sensors that they use like in the hospital or even on your phone, like for example here, you know, they use, you know, they have the little light sensors on your phone. Most sensors that, wearable sensors that claim to be able to measure heart rate and blood flow are limited to like your fingers or your toes because they use light-based sensors, which can't penetrate very deep. Light attenuates quickly or loses signal quickly in the human body, whereas with magnetic fields, we're getting much better penetration depth. So we can measure like deep arterial flow where you might have blockages or something like that. So.
I'm sure you thought of putting this on the back of the iWatch, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much.